Part of the way to solve organizational problems is to make sure you have a fully functioning staff. And so the staff end up doing a lot of coordinating type work. There are people who are making decisions. There are people who are making sure that other organizations are working with them. People who are working to make sure that your organization is working well. And then there's obviously this administrative staff. But we can talk about these different sort of types of staff. They can form pure staff, auxiliary staff, and control staff. This is all in the book, and it's not something I love talking about, but staff provide all sorts of different functions. There's general support, a pure staff. They help do some of the functions. They don't give direction. They're not doing anything more except to say, this is on the agenda, this is an important part, let's make sure it happens. They might identify issues that are likely to require action. They make sure that due process happens. They're trying to make sure that information gets processed, that they're monitoring important issues, but they're really not making decisions. They're the support, right? Those people are vital at gathering information and making sure that the processes work properly so that we can coordinate agency behavior. These auxiliary staff provide housekeeping function, other administrative support like accounting, some maybe research, public affairs, some publishing. These are auxiliary staff. Now, control staff are the ones that we want to think about mostly for coordination. They try to make sure that organizations are doing their job. They're leveraging control over the organization. They're pushing. They're using performance measures. They're monitoring. They're enforcing compliance with agencies' directives and interagency agreements. Standards and procedures. Control staff end up being important when we talk about coordination. Now, reorganization of the bureaucracy is really, really hard to do. We've talked about horizontal coordination. We've talked about interagency conflict. We've talked about the legitimate roles of these different government agencies. We have to make sure that agencies are functioning because organizational problems occur over and over and over again. When we talked about vertical integration, I said that vertical organization or reorganization is really, really difficult because it changes the power structure among these organizations. Now, presidents and governors have tried really hard to reorganize the bureaucracy because they want to work better and they're managing. They can see where there are gaps and there's problems in how these organizations function and relate to each other. Well, presidents are managers. They don't design or authorize organizations. They just manage. They can make some small changes here and there, but mostly they can't reorganize. Congress or the legislature has to do reorganization, which means we need congressional support and approval. So the manager, the president, the governor, the mayor, may be seeing how these organizations function and don't function, but they have to convey that to Congress or the legislature or the city council in order to get approval for change. Now, here's some problems. Every president has tried to reorganize, but it's really difficult to change those ideas into action. So why is that? Well, Congress has vested interests. We often think about these as an iron triangle. Members of Congress sit on committees, and those committees oversee the functions of agencies. Those agencies regulate industries, and those industries lobby members of Congress, and those members of Congress get, political donations for those agencies in their area. Now, because of that, this becomes a cozy relationship in the form of a triangle. We have Congress, we have the regulated body, and then we have the regulators. Congress oversees the regulators sees the regulated body, and they fund congressional races. So think about something like the airline industry. Boeing's out of Washington. If you are the member of Congress whose district includes Boeing in it, you know that Boeing is a big taxpayer, you know that Boeing creates jobs, you probably get elected because you want to protect Boeing's industry, and so you try and sit on the airline oversight committee, the transportation committee. Okay, well, that's cool. As a member of Congress, you're sitting on this committee, you're watching over the FAA. The FAA regulates the industry. If you're sitting on the committee, you're also passing laws that involve regulating the airlines. That's all good for you because it makes sure that you can protect that industry that's really important for your constituents. The regulators, the FAA, are monitoring Boeing. They're checking to make sure that they're building the airplanes properly. They're imposing sanctions and fees. They're also checking to make sure that whatever is involved in the airlines works well. So the committee watches over the FAA to make sure the FAA is using their authority properly under the law. The FAA reports back to the members of Congress. Okay, the FAA works with the airline industry, like Boeing. They work on understanding the technology, making sure that the planes are compliant, but also the FAA are going to be like airplane geeks. They know everything about airplanes. They're going to go to airplane trade shows. They're going to learn about airplane technology. Who do they learn that from? Well, from Boeing and Airbus and all these other people. So they kind of get cozy in that relationship between the manufacturers or the industry and the regulators. So that's a cozy relationship. But then here's the other part that's kind of screwy, is that the airline industry, especially someone like Boeing, is going to try and fund candidates for Congress who are interested in protecting that industry, to protect the jobs, to protect the tax base, make sure that industry is going well. Because if the industry fails under your watch, you don't get reelected. If you lose jobs under your watch as a member of Congress, you don't get reelected. So the industry lobbies members of Congress. They fund congressional campaigns that will help benefit candidates who will look favorably upon their industry. Now, because of that relationship, whenever the FAA starts to be under threat for not coordinating their behavior with someone else, and they're going to reorganize so the FAA can be, a better part of maybe Homeland Security or, some other Department of Commerce, Department of Transportation, like it gets switched in its role, it loses that power, which means it puts at risk that members of Congress's ability to regulate the FAA or to monitor the FAA. If they can't regulate or monitor the FAA, then they might lose some of their relationships with industry and some of that campaign contribution. So members of Congress fight reorganization often because it would disrupt their power. So everyone, including the FAA's power, might be changed. The interest groups or the industry might lose some of their power, and members of Congress might lose some of their power. So these departments and bureaus seek to protect their turf, like stick where you're at. Members of Congress don't want to switch unless there's some real big crisis. And so most reorganization efforts end up being thwarted whenever a reorganization is a threat. So this makes it difficult to do sort of vertical reorganization. So a lot of times we end up doing horizontal coordination to try and get agencies to work better together rather than reorganize. Now, all these organization problems we've talked about inside your organization, trying to find new direction and bases, interagency agreements, horizontal coordination, reorganization, all these end up falling into the same patterns that recur over and over and over and over again. So there's some structural problems like inability to communicate with each other, but there's also political motivations to organizational failure. In other words, sometimes Congress and the president fight, and in that process, it causes mixed messages for the organizations. Sometimes organizations are intentionally demoted or moved inside other organizations to show that they're not important. Sometimes they're marginalized. Sometimes they're given political leaders that don't run them effectively intentionally. So there's all sorts of reasons why organization problems can occur. So, there's all sorts of these crazy dynamics when you think about structures and political control and how we hire and how they talk to each other. Organizations are fascinating, but when you try and solve some of these problems, we have recurring patterns of success and failure and other problems in other areas. So organizations end up in this constant cycle of being improved and causing new problems. And there's no real clear solution on how to fix it permanently, but understanding how these patterns occur might prevent future problems.